Why is the sky blue?
Exactly. You know? And this is the Larry King technique. You know? Of course, it didn't work that well for him. He got fired. Still, it does work. Sky's blue because of government interference.
You got a new book called Driving Like Crazy. But, I'll be getting my license soon. So I got any recommendations?
Yeah, don't read it. Everything in there is something you shouldn't do with your new driver's license. So buy it by all means, of course. I mean, I'm in the book selling business, but let it sit for 15 years, you know, until you're over 30, and then read it.
Okay, and what do you think about the situation in the Gulf?
The Gulf of Mexico. I was thinking of the Persian Gulf. Two very complicated situations. Everything we do for progress entails costs and risks. I mean, there's no doubt about it. Even the simplest things like learning to read. When we, as a race, learned to read, as the human race learned to read, they lost certain abilities to memorize things, and they lost a whole section of oral culture that was very valuable. I mean, nobody wrote down the Iliad until about 500 years after somebody came up with it. So, like, we don't know what the Iliad was really like. We lost that when we lost the ability when we gained the ability to read. So, it's a shame, it's awful, it should be fixed. If somebody did something wrong, they should be liable for it and all that. But we can't expect human progress without costs and risks. And I spent a long time as a foreign correspondent, 20 years as a foreign correspondent. I've seen a lot of really severe poverty, and my biggest worry is about people not having enough to eat, dying from simple diseases, from not having a place to live. The world's biggest problem is poverty. The only answer to poverty is progress. The only way to progress is through enterprise, but you can't do it without risk and costs. So, I guess suck it up is the answer.
How do you feel about homeschooling? Do you think there should be more regulations or less?
Well, I don't think it needs to be regulated. I'm all for it, and I think that what homeschooling is in many cases is the creation in the home of an expensive private education for a lot less money. We send our kids to a very small school. There are only 100 kids in the school. There's only one class per grade. There are no more than 10 kids in the class, maybe 12. They all know each other personally. It's sort of homeschooling away from home is what it is. If we didn't have that school available and we couldn't afford it, it's not terribly expensive, but still it's not free, we would do homeschooling in preference to public schooling, especially at the higher grades. I mean, where we see public schooling falling down is as the kids get into more complicated things that need a little moral guidance, that need discussion. Then, when you've got a set curriculum, maybe an uninvolved teacher, a large class, disruptive behavior, it starts to fall apart.
How do you feel about requiring journalists to have a license and the government bailing out newspapers?
Well, as an unlicensed journalist, obviously I'm not in favor of going back to J school, which I never went to. I was an English major. I never took a journalism class in my life. Journalism is a trade. It's not a profession. And it's not brain surgery. It's a trade, like bricklaying, like being a carpenter. There's only one way to learn it, which is by doing it. It used to be some of the most famous journalists in the 20th century, like guys like H.L. Mencken, never went to college. They went straight from high school. Admittedly, high school is a little more rigorous than it is now. But they went straight from high school to jobs as cover reporters. It is a craft. And it used to be mostly a craft people like myself that came out of working class backgrounds. And if you didn't want to get up early in the morning and lift things, you could either become a priest or a journalist. So you had to decide, which whether you like women and booze or just booze. So, as for the government bailing out newspapers, the government shouldn't be bailing out anything, really. I understand the impulse. You hate to see people out of work. And, if you're in government, you feel it's like your job to mitigate human suffering. But the real genius of capitalism isn't success. The real genius of capitalism is failure. If something's a bad idea, it doesn't work. So if you, for instance, buy an ice cream truck, drive it around the neighborhood in New Hampshire in February, and you don't get any sales, capitalism is trying to tell you you had a stupid idea. You don't want the government to come in there and bail you out. We'll buy your ice cream.
Do you consider yourself a libertarian?
Yeah, with a small L. Because capital L libertarians tend to rely on logic to the exclusion of almost everything else. And human life is not completely logical, and we're not that smart. Also, capital L libertarians tend to be a lot more, I go to church, and that's not logical enough. Not all capital L libertarians, but many capital libertarians consider that to be illogical. Also, politics is illogical because it's just people, and it's just people getting together. There's no starting point for politics. They've been getting together since they came down out of trees. Politics will never end. There's no purpose to politics, really, except that we get along with each other. There's no overall purpose. Which sounds like a cynical thing to say, but I don't mean it that way. I simply mean that politics is the way people get along with each other and sort out their relationships. And naturally, because emotions come into play, it can't all be rigidly logical. And some capital L libertarians want it all to be rigidly logical. I just don't think that's possible.
Did you grow up wanting to be involved in politics?
Yes, my family was very political. My great-grandfather was a county sheriff in downstate Illinois, very involved in Republican politics from back in the 19th century. So I got that whole side. My father, they weren't as structured about it, but they were. My grandfather was a small businessman in a very union town, and that turned him into a Republican. I don't think it was really well articulated, but it made him very conservative because he had experienced that whole. He had a lot of trouble with all the sorts of New Deal stuff. So it made him very conservative. He wasn't really articulate. My grandmother was on my mother's side was very articulate conservative. And my grandfather was kind of inarticulate. Damn them all. But I definitely grew up around politics.
Do you think Ron Paul's going to run in 2012?
I don't know. It seems sort of that once they get bit by the once they get the itch to run, they have to keep scratching. All I can say about that, I have a great deal of respect for the man. We do have to face the fact that when it comes down to presidents, there can only be one president. And we take a little lesson from the Democrats here. Al Gore would have been president if it hadn't been for Ralph Nader. And so one thing that I hope Paul won't do is run in such a way that we get a president maybe not as good as him, but maybe a lot worse than the alternative. I mean, there's a weird practical side to politics. You can't always get the person you want. And of course, you can't always depend on the person you want staying the person you want. The office changes them.
Yeah, like Obama.
Ask any leftist about Obama. They're very, very deeply disappointed with Obama because the circumstances, the fact of being president, made him move toward the center. It may not look like that to us, but to people who are way to the left of him.
If you don't mind me asking, would you vote for Ron Paul?
What's that?
I said, if you don't mind me asking, would you vote for Ron Paul?
It would depend on the circumstances. Yes, if I felt he had a chance of winning. No, if I felt that voting for him would cause the worst of two evils. Or would tend to cause the worst of two evils.
And that's it. Thank you.
You're very welcome. It's good to meet you.